There's something worth saying plainly that rarely comes up in a typical doctor's appointment, not because physicians don't know it, but because the visit usually ends before there's time to get there. A person's body can remain technically fine on paper while their life quietly shrinks around them. That's not a figure of speech. It's something that shows up slowly and almost invisibly in patients who look perfectly healthy by the numbers. Normal labs, blood pressure under control, nothing alarming on a chart, while something else is fading. Their voice gets quieter, their world gets smaller. Decisions that used to be entirely theirs start being made by someone else. Most people never see it coming, because the habits that actually prevent this kind of decline are so ordinary, so far outside what a short appointment ever has time to cover, that nobody ever mentions them. After decades in cardiology, sitting across from thousands of patients in their late 70s, 80s, and beyond, the same pattern keeps showing up, one that research is only now starting to fully explain. One type of patient reaches 80 and is still driving to their own appointments, still remembering every grandchild's birthday, still cooking the family dinner, still laughing loud enough for the neighbors to hear, still deciding how their own day unfolds. The other type starts out exactly the same age, often the same diagnosis, but somewhere along the way, their world begins to contract. What's genuinely striking is how rarely people see that shift coming. Fewer than 1 in 8 adults over 75 consistently maintains all 6 of the habits described here. Anyone who does isn't just healthy. They're operating in a range that's genuinely measurable and exceptional. The first habit is intentional walking, not just movement. A common mistake after 75 is treating walking purely as transportation, car to store, bedroom to kitchen, and counting that as exercise. It isn't, at least not in the way that protects the cardiovascular system. People who age particularly well tend to walk with real cardiovascular intent, at a pace that raises the heart rate to somewhere around 50 to 65% of maximum, sustained for at least 20 minutes, not a casual stroll. After 70, artery walls tend to stiffen at an accelerated pace, a structural change often referred to as arteriosclerosis. As arteries lose elasticity, the heart works harder, blood pressure climbs, and the brain gradually receives slightly less blood over time. Sustained aerobic walking has been associated in research with measurable reductions in arterial stiffness, not just a slower rate of decline, but genuine improvement. Picture arteries like a garden hose left in the sun too long. They lose their flexibility, pressure builds inside, and things eventually crack at the connections. Intentional walking helps restore some of that lost flexibility. A reasonable target is 20 to 30 minutes, 5 days a week, at a pace where conversation is possible, but singing wouldn't be comfortable. Morning timing seems to matter too. Some research has found that morning exercise produces a full 24-hour blood pressure benefit that afternoon exercise doesn't replicate as reliably. Consider a retired engineer in his late 70s, with blood pressure running around 148/91 on 2 medications, who had quietly accepted that as simply what aging felt like. One change, a 30-minute walk each morning before breakfast, brought his numbers down to around 134/82 within 2 months, and he later described feeling like he'd gotten a decade back. One habit, 30 minutes a day. The second habit is protecting sleep with the same seriousness as a medical prescription. Poor sleep after 75 isn't just an inconvenience. It functions almost like a slow-motion cardiovascular event, happening nightly and going largely unaddressed. Deep, slow-wave sleep can decline substantially from its levels in someone's 30s, and this is the phase during which the body repairs arterial walls, regulates inflammation, and clears waste from the brain through its natural drainage system. When deep sleep disappears, that nightly cleanup runs incompletely, night after night, year after year. Research has linked disrupted sleep in adults over 70 to a meaningfully higher accumulation of the plaques associated with Alzheimer's disease. The cardiovascular side is just as serious. Fragmented sleep tends to eliminate the normal nighttime dip in blood pressure that cardiologists view as one of the most reliable markers of long-term heart health. And when that dip consistently disappears, cardiovascular strain accumulates much as it would from daytime high blood pressure. People who age particularly well tend to treat sleep with near-military consistency. The same bedtime within about half an hour every night, the same wake time every morning including weekends, a bedroom kept relatively cool, and no screens for the last hour before bed, since mental stimulation close to bedtime has been shown to meaningfully delay sleep onset in older adults. A simple technique worth trying is 10 minutes of slow diaphragmatic breathing before bed, inhaling for a count of 4, exhaling for a count of 6, which has been associated with meaningfully lower nighttime cortisol and improved deep sleep, at no cost at all. The third habit is eating protein in a deliberate, spread-out pattern throughout the day. The old idea that protein needs decrease with age turns out to be not just wrong, but arguably one of the more harmful pieces of nutritional folklore still circulating. After 75, the body generally needs meaningfully more dietary protein per pound of body weight than a healthy 30-year-old would. The reason being something called anabolic resistance, where aging muscle cells become less responsive to the protein-building signal. The muscles aren't lazy, they're simply harder to reach. Without enough of that signal, sarcopenia sets in, progressive muscle loss that's been linked to meaningfully higher fall risk and a higher likelihood of losing basic daily function within a few years. Research involving thousands of adults aged 70 to 85 found that those consuming roughly 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight daily, spread across 3 or more meals, had notably lower hospitalization rates from fall-related injuries and better immune response overall. A practical approach is aiming for roughly 25 to 35 grams of protein at each of 3 main meals, around 4 to 5 ounces of chicken, fish, eggs, Greek yogurt, or legumes, spread out because aging muscles can typically only make full use of around 35 to 40 grams at a single sitting for muscle synthesis. Pairing each protein-rich meal with a source of vitamin C, an orange, bell pepper, a splash of lemon juice, supports collagen production, which helps maintain connective tissue and vascular integrity later in life. Consider a retired teacher in her late 70s who lost around 14 pounds of lean muscle over 18 months, with grip strength testing in a low percentile, something her previous doctor had dismissed as a normal part of aging, when in fact it was largely preventable. After about 12 weeks of restructured protein intake, she regained roughly 9 pounds of lean mass, and her grip strength rose dramatically. She later said she hadn't realized how much of herself had been quietly disappearing. Protein doesn't just feed muscle. It helps protect the version of a person that still shows up in daily life. The fourth habit is maintaining at least one genuine, active social connection every day. This is the one that tends to surprise people most, since it sounds more emotional than clinical, but the data behind it is substantial. Large-scale research on hundreds of thousands of adults has found that chronic social isolation carries a mortality risk comparable to smoking around 15 cigarettes a day. Separate research from aging institutes has linked loneliness to meaningfully faster cognitive decline, higher dementia risk, and elevated levels of inflammatory markers that directly affect cardiovascular tissue. Genuine social interaction, by contrast, triggers oxytocin release, helps suppress cortisol, reduces inflammation, and keeps neural pathways structurally active. The social brain functions much like a muscle. The same neurons that fire during real conversation are involved in memory and sense of self. And when those neurons go quiet for extended periods, the pathways they support start to weaken, becoming harder to rebuild after 75. The key is at least one genuinely engaged interaction daily. A real phone call, a community group, a walking companion, a meal with someone who challenges your thinking a little. Passive presence, like being in a room with the television on, doesn't count. The interaction needs to be active. Consider a woman in her early 80s who lost her husband of over 50 years and withdrew almost entirely from social life, brought in by her daughter about 8 months later showing measurable cognitive decline. Rather than changing medication, the intervention was building a social schedule, a book club, rotating daily phone calls with family, and a regular volunteer shift at the local library. 8 months later, her cognitive scores had returned close to baseline, and her daughter said simply, "She sounds like herself again." Social connection after 75 isn't a comfort. It functions as something closer to a biological requirement. Pairing social time with light movement, walking and talking at the same time, appears to have a stronger combined effect on brain-supporting growth factors than either activity alone. The fifth habit is monitoring blood pressure at home with real precision. Most adults over 75 managing blood pressure only see their numbers a couple of times a year at an office visit, told whether the reading looks fine, then sent home for months, which means an enormous amount of potentially protective cardiovascular information never gets captured. Blood pressure isn't a fixed number. It shifts with time of day, activity, stress, sodium intake, and medication timing. Large clinical trials have shown that treating blood pressure to a lower systolic target than previously standard meaningfully reduced major cardiovascular events and overall mortality compared with a more lenient target. But hitting that kind of target reliably requires knowing the numbers across multiple points in the day, not just a single office reading, which tends to run higher anyway due to appointment-related anxiety. People who age particularly well tend to treat a home blood pressure cuff the way someone managing diabetes treats a glucose monitor. Same time each morning, 5 minutes of seated rest beforehand, cuff positioned at heart level, results logged and reviewed for patterns, and that log brought to appointments rather than relying solely on the office number. Consider a retired firefighter in his late 70s with an office reading of 142/88, who appeared reasonably controlled on medication, until 2 weeks of home readings told a very different story, running 158 to 162 most mornings and spiking toward 170 some evenings after sodium-heavy meals. He wasn't controlled, he'd simply appeared that way in the office. Adjusting medication timing, modifying evening eating habits, and adding a morning walk before the first daily reading brought his morning average down to around 128 within 6 weeks. Not because of a new medication, but because his actual pattern had finally been identified. Taking a reading before that first cup of coffee matters too, since caffeine can meaningfully raise systolic pressure within half an hour in older adults. The sixth and final habit is a daily, purposeful cognitive challenge, one that produces genuine, productive discomfort. This is the habit fewer than roughly 1 in 8 adults over 75 maintains consistently, and researchers have described it as one of the most underused tools available for supporting long-term brain health without a prescription. This isn't about crossword puzzles or passive reading. It's about actively learning something genuinely new, a skill, a language, a musical instrument, something that pushes the brain slightly outside its comfort zone. After 75, the brain tends to lean more heavily on familiar, established neural pathways to conserve energy. But that same tendency gradually depletes what's sometimes called cognitive reserve, the brain's buffer against age-related decline. Not unlike extra memory in a computer that lets the system absorb more wear before problems show up. There's a real cardiovascular connection here too, since the same vascular risk factors that damage the heart, high blood pressure, arterial stiffness, poor nighttime blood pressure dipping, also reduce blood flow to the brain and accelerate cognitive decline, meaning protecting cognitive reserve is closely tied to protecting the heart. Long-term studies following older adults into their late 80s found that those who engaged in genuinely novel cognitive activity for at least 30 minutes daily showed notably slower brain volume loss on imaging and a lower likelihood of a later dementia diagnosis. Learning a new language, for instance, has been associated with a meaningfully delayed average age of dementia onset, and learning a musical instrument engages motor control, auditory processing, memory, and emotional regulation all at once. The key word is active. Watching someone else play guitar doesn't count as learning guitar. The actual struggle of working through a chord progression with an instrument in hand is where the real benefit lives. The resistance isn't the obstacle, it's the mechanism. Consider a retired civil engineer in his late 70s who had started struggling with names and following complex conversation. Alongside his cardiac care, he picked something he'd always wanted to learn, oil painting, and committed to doing it daily. He was, by his own admission, quite bad at first, and said so with a kind of pride. 18 months later, he'd completed over 20 paintings, joined a local art group, and showed measurable improvement across several areas of cognitive testing. Genuine improvement, not just maintenance, at nearly 80 years old. Pairing this kind of daily cognitive challenge with dietary DHA, found in salmon, mackerel, sardines, or quality fish oil, has been linked in research to stronger neuroplasticity responses to cognitive training, essentially supporting the brain's ability to absorb the benefit of what it's learning. The decade of life between roughly 75 and 85 often gets treated, by medicine, media, and sometimes even families, as a kind of waiting period, something to be managed rather than actively lived. That framing undersells what the body and mind are actually capable of at that age. The 6 habits described here, intentional walking, protected sleep, deliberate protein intake, a daily social connection, home blood pressure monitoring, and purposeful cognitive challenge, aren't about turning back the clock. They're about making full use of the time still on it, still driving to your own appointments, still remembering where you left your keys, still cooking the meal the whole family shows up for, still being the person whose opinion carries weight in the room, still laughing until your eyes water at something a grandchild said. That's what independence looks like, and it's genuinely possible to build toward even starting later than expected.